Good afternoon. Welcome to the IISS. My name is Anastasia Voronkova. I'm a research fellow for Armed Conflict here and editor for Armed Conflict Survey. I run the Armed Conflict program, which aims to assess the key trends in active armed conflicts worldwide. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this event on African youth addressing root causes of insecurity and migration. According to UN data, 10 of the world's countries with the highest proportion of youth population are in Africa. Youth population in Africa is expected to continue to grow, more than doubling from current levels by 2055. We have seen many of these youth join and become increasingly engaged with radical jihadist groups, and migration also remains extremely high and is a major policy challenge for the EU and its partners. To speak about some of the local realities for youth and in Africa and policy responses and challenges, I'm delighted to welcome Mariah Bout. Mariah has a wealth of experience researching and working with youth in Africa and beyond. Her research consultancy, Spring Factor, focuses on the role of youth in conflict-affected settings. Formerly, she was team leader within the Stabilization and Peace-Building Unit of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has worked extensively in Kenya and in Kosovo. Mariah will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and discussion. Mariah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. And if you could please help me keep time.
Yes,
because,
I will.
It's my favorite topic, and sometimes I get carried away.
That's all right.
So thanks a lot to the IISS for IISS to invite me to come and do a presentation on this research topic that I've been working on for the last 4 years, and currently we're based in The Hague, but we work quite a lot in Africa to continue collecting our data on this. So I'm very happy to see also quite some faces of people that I've worked with in the past. So that's great to see. Even actually a colleague with whom I worked on Kosovo. So that's great to see. In that sense, I really feel we can have an interesting discussion today. I would like to tell you that the title we've picked suggests a very, very broad scope, and it's actually challenging to bring together two symptoms like insecurity and the link to extremism and terrorism, and also migration. But I promise you it will come together, yeah? And also through our perspective, which is the youth. So let me come straight to the discussion point that I would like to have with you, which is that current policies to address instability, and especially counterterrorism, and policies to manage irregular migration in the Sahel region, and also further into through Africa to the Horn, promote further drivers for young people to break out. This is my discussion statement, which I would like you to chew on in the next 20 minutes. And of course, with my policy background, I would always look for ways forward that would help us get out of a particularly crisis situation unfolding right now. So in that sense, I'm happy that we have at least half an hour for discussion, because I think we will need that, and I'm very curious for your perspectives on this. This is quite a entry into a fairly dramatic situation that we have seen unfolding in the last decade, which is that many armed, violent groups have managed to penetrate many parts of Africa, especially the parts where there is local power vacuums. And in those parts, they have managed to get a basis from which to operate. And of course, we all know what triggered the particular terrorism and the instability and the influx of terrorist groups in the Sahel, which of course is the crisis in Libya in 2011, etc. But of course, the roots of this crisis were already there, with instability in the south of Algeria and groups being pushed southwards into Mali. So actually, Libya is still is a clearinghouse of many of the problems that we see now in terms of networks and from where they operate. But of course, in the Sahara, there have been networks operating already for I don't know how many thousand years. There's all kinds of routes, which this map, which is from the what is it again? The Norwegian Center for Global Analysis from last year. It's not even up to date anymore because developments go very quickly in terms of these groups. But it's just to indicate to you how these networks unfolded over a period of 10 years so very quickly. And what I'm very interested in is to see also the horizontal arrows, which is the connections between the different armed groups which are into crime, smuggling, and terrorism. And nowadays, migrant smuggling. The biggest business right there. The biggest business on which terrorist groups thrive. They thrive on it. And I actually have some recent data. It might now even be more. But migrant smuggling has taken over other smuggling like arms and even drugs. Arms trade last year was estimated to bring as incomes for all those networks $15 to $30 million. Okay, that's quite a lot. Drugs, a little bit less, especially strong in particular areas and with cocaine, etc. $10 to $20 million it would, generate for the networks that would benefit from it. Now, migrant trade, migrant smuggling is 255 to 323 million US dollar in Libya alone. And as you probably know, there's an estimated 600,000 young people from all over Africa and also Syria, but that's a part of it. But from all over Africa, they're waiting to go on a boat. And there's no coincidence that the Islamic State is expanding its network very quickly because it started to control especially those ports and those routes where those migrants have to go through in order to reach Italy. As soon as the smugglers push off the boat, basically it's out of their hands and they don't have any interest. So many of the boats sink. That doesn't even reach our news channels anymore that much, in the sense that it's not headlines anymore. But many boats are still sinking because those smugglers have no interest for their clients to arrive safely. They count on them to be picked up by boats. So the smugglers' network has completely captured the migrant trade. And in that sense, it's also a big financier for terrorist groups. And that's why we are expecting, and that's not even a, let's say, a minimal scenario, but we're expecting IS to grow exponentially because of this influx of money coming from all over the continent. Because we always portray the image of migrants being the poorest of the poor. Well, if you bring them together, they bring a lot of money. A lot of money. And now that Libya is this unstable, this will continue. But even in the best scenario that Libya stabilizes and that we, in a way, manage to mitigate the consequences of the Unified Protector operation that we have staged, okay? Then even it's like a waterbed. They will find other routes to go through, and it's impossible. Impossible. Even for those that are into security assistance, how could you ever close off that border? So, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem, which has grown so quickly, and why irregular migration and growth of terrorist groups is so interlinked. So, what I'm going to talk about is how, not only through new sources of income, but also why they have been able to thrive, why they haven't been chased out, why there has been such a fertile breeding ground and so many recruitment bases around in Africa. So then we're coming to some of the research I've done. So we're diving from a very, broad geopolitical dynamics to individuals now. I'm taking you there, yeah? So we've been researching the issue of a youth perspective in many different localities in Africa. So I used to be posted as a diplomat in Kenya. I've worked a lot with people from the Horn area. So I'm building a bit on that time also, maybe remember in 2007 Kenya exploded after the elections, and many young people engaged in very violent, fighting their peers from other tribal groups. And this, of course, was politically instigated, but this started my intrigue for young people. Why do they pick up arms? Why do they fight? Yeah, and if they wouldn't fight while they're being manipulated into it, what would it take? What would it take for them to see a perspective and be sure that they have much to lose if they would fight? So this is the kind of start of the research. But in the last couple of years, we've been mostly working in the Sahel and West Africa and interviewing young people there, but also young people that had just arrived. So I went to Paris in May, just after the big surge, the migrants coming in. There were thousands back then who had arrived all over, and many were concentrated in Paris. So I've also spoken to Senegalese boys. I've also spoken to Ivorian girls. So in that sense, the research group is also diverse. It's not only boys who are seen as a group at risk or of risk, but also girls. So soon I'll be going to North Ghana and to Ivory Coast as well to see the other side of it. So what pushes them out. So, but I'm also building on research which is of sociological and anthropological backgrounds. because I have an international relations background, but I think it's rather limiting. I think we need more in order to understand this, trying to bring this together. So the work of Summers, the work of Honwana. So why do young people look for alternatives and want to break out, which is an important question for me. And the preliminary findings that I had collected, and I started drawing because I don't like too many, I like visuals and to see how we can visualize this issue. And that's why many of the youth that I spoke to feel that they are not recognized by those in charge in their country. So that's at a community level, that is at a more regional level, but also at a central level. So the basic issue here, and I could go on about this for a long time, but I'll try to summarize it. They're being denied access to all kinds of assets which are important to them. And of course, jobs is an important one, but also other assets like land, like social positions, like political positions, or power. So they can't really participate, and the normal exchange which would work with, let's say, within the different classes in many African societies, and I can't really generalize, but of course there's many, there's also classes within, for example, ethnic groups, etc. So it's a bit complicated to generalize, but normally there is an exchange going on with elites, and especially when elites are in government and would have to be re-elected, then indeed there would be an exchange with many youth are not allowed to vote or still, won't vote. So it's that exchange isn't really, it's not an interesting constituency for elites in that sense. So this is what I found out in Mali, and also I know some of those situations in Kenya. That access denied is an important reason why they are frustrated, and also, at a later stage also grieve, because they have to cope often in the informal sector, while many of them have been trained, if they've gone to school, that the highest goal is to be part of government, not a private sector, no, but to be part of government, to have a public sector job. And so their training is irrelevant, but still they're expected to se débrouiller, to cope in a way that is not recognized. They can't make the step towards adulthood. There's many rites of passage which they are not managing to fulfill. Like, for example, Rwanda is not really a country which is part of my research, but there you have an interesting one. Every Rwandan boy that wants to marry has to build a house. And there's all kinds of requirements of building a house. So you first need a job, then it needs to be a regular income, etc., and only then he can marry. So there's quite some constraints and obstacles in their path towards adulthood. And in the informal sector, they're being not recognized. They're being they're being repressed also. Not in the least, because we also feel everything should be formalized. Yeah. So African governments, take that also as an excuse to push down the informal sector. But the informal sector, there's a lot of entrepreneurship there. There's a lot of innovation, and that's why I feel it should be much more recognized. But the feeling of alienation from the elites that determine where assets go, determine where resources go, jobs go, and they feel outcasted in that sense. And of course, here we're not talking about the elite youth, because that's a small group that is supposed to be the successor of the current elites, and those are being nurtured and protected, etc. I've also spoken to those. Those are often the ones that stand at conferences and represent the youth. They don't. They don't. They have completely different incentives. They often ask for jobs. Yeah, but that's not the only problem. So it's a kind of limiting perspective. There's many more constraints, and they're related to connections. They're related to all kinds of access to finance, etc., which they do have. Okay, so international responses. I know it looks a bit like a simplistic picture, but it's just to give you the idea of, like Anastasia already mentioned, the youth bulge is already quite with us. A lot of new jobs have to be created. A lot of space has to be created for youth. In 2050, it's expected that there are 2.5 billion people on the African continent, of which this is a large estimate, put it like that, of which half would be youth. Nigeria is expected to be, I think, the third or fourth densely populated country in the world. Have you seen that? Nigeria, yeah, and Congo. So in that sense, this is what we're looking at. But access continues to be denied to the majority of African youth, and it's very difficult to get through. The rites of passage are too hard for them, and there's all kinds of obstacles that are also being put by the state that we are supporting. That's why we have to. Yeah. So in terms of our developments effort in the past, I know that youth is now a fashionable topic, and also, for example, your government has been developing a specific youth policy. So I can't, evaluate that one because I think it's fairly new. But what I've seen in the past, and also our own experiences from, for example, the Dutch government, there has been a target group approach. It used to be gender, now it's youth, to be simplistic. And the problem with this target group approach is that especially in poor societies, whenever you're trying to assist a target group, of course the broader community wants to benefit. When I wanted to start a entrepreneurship program in Ségou in Mali, I had to go through the elders. I thought it was innocent. It wasn't. No. It's something which is meant for the whole community, because it's a very, in that sense, it's quite some social cohesion in Mali. We all take care for one another. So target group, the money is going to be divided in the way that is specific to the local context, and we don't have control over it. So I don't believe much in that target group approach. I also have seen that it's not really based on specific youth constraints that are context related, and that's the difficult part about this presentation. I can only generalize, but I can tell you many stories about how the context influences the specific constraints and how we should link to those. There has been quite a technical approach, whereas we need a political economy approach that I know that in UK you're further advanced with that, but still it's difficult. And we've been mainly focusing in the development on supply, which is training, coaching, mentoring, you know what. And of course, you have to create space and you have to create demand for young people to play their roles, or else they'll be frustrated. So you can work on the let's say the supply side, to put it bluntly, make them ready and capacitated, etc. And there they are. Nobody's waiting for them. Nobody is making way. So that's useless, and it can cause a lot of frustration. That's what I've seen, and I think I'm going to see that also in Ivory Coast, maybe in North Ghana. One of the trickiest part is it's the working in institutional silos, yeah, development in its own silo. Well, you know, diplomacy in a silo. Let's say the political part, and also the security dimension also in their silo. So about development, is it too little, too late? That's what I've been looking at, and whether we can still bounce back in terms of promoting opportunities for youth in their own environments. So many of the dilemmas that youth are dealing with, and I put it again here very bluntly, fight or flight. There are many around that would offer youth to make a quick buck. And it's not only male youth, it's also female youth, but in another way. To support groups, armed groups, criminal groups that would offer them the kind of livelihood or protection. Protection is a very important one that the state, weak states cannot do. And the other way out is of course migration, and there's many drivers which we normally focus on livelihoods, but it's definitely also a lack of perspective, and I've heard many youth speak about those how they cannot rely on the state for them to create perspectives. And they don't understand why we continue supporting corrupt state structures in order to help them. For them, it's very counterintuitive. So, what I've seen in the last couple of years, in terms of international responses to some of the symptoms we're seeing, like extremism, terrorism, but also irregular migration. Recently, in the last year, we've seen a lot of policies there that they're increasingly securitized, and which has a lot of impact on youth. And I'm trying to also the position of youth, which I'm trying to show you later. With counterterrorism, what we do, I already stressed that. We continue working through weak state structures and through corrupt state structures. Can I give you one example? So I worked in Kenya on anti-corruption and anti-corruption within the police force. You may know the administration police. Administration police is responsible for border control. They asked us, before we work with you on reform, we need to have some quick wins. So we want to have equipment, we want to have cars, jeeps, etc. And we said, no, we can't do that. But they got it anyhow, huh? They got it anyhow. I'm not telling you by who, but they got it. So we went to Wajir once on a field trip. And the border was quite far, but there were cars driving on and off. And I said, what's this? Brand new jeeps. And they said, it's the administration police taxi service. Yeah. It goes from the Somali border to Eastleigh in Nairobi. Yeah. So who they were transporting, probably they didn't care. But, you know, the people who would have money to afford a trip like that would probably not have a very beneficial effect on, let's say, stability. Those were often those involved in piracy or crime or whatever. So, let me go to the next one, migration management. The tendency, especially in the past year, is to invest in externalizing border controls. And the train and equip approach is very risky, because who knows what they're going to do with their new equipment, yeah? And often that's a means to exert power or to extort, yeah? And even in countries that we consider stable, yeah, stable, but very corrupt. And it has a lot of consequences for young people, you know. It can really promote that kind of repression that I spoke about before. So what do I think is important? I think we should really mitigate the unintended consequences of our policies, not to exacerbate youth undermining structures and the kind of repression that I spoke about. So that, first of all, is important. That is the priority. Right now, I think there should be a lot of advocacy on it, but also just very practical advice to those that provide that kind of assistance. So in that sense, it's a sensitivity to that. And I already told you, I've seen a lot in my 20 years experience to be aware of capture by predatory elites. We see that everywhere. And if we keep on having a target group approach, we can do that. But we have to be very aware of local conditions and how things are being managed and lessons from the past. We know a lot, but we don't take it into account because we want to have quick wins. So security support should really be conditionalized by accountable governance. I know this is it's illogical that I would say it, but it takes a lot. It takes so much. Political will, especially, also from our side. And then, finally, I'm not in favor of putting a bag of money in order to quell these kind of symptoms. But if you do it wisely, I think if you make policies more coherent, you can really promote youth inclusion and then creating space for youth, helping to create it. But it requires a lot of action and participation. And then finally, a locally led, politically smart approach, which takes a lot of effort, but you can really work there with partners that have leverage on local elites and on government. So there's a couple of organizations that do that very well, but of course, they don't have a big scale, short-term, quick win. But together, these small steps would add up to a concerted effort to help address root causes of insecurity and to help youth gain more opportunities and perspective in their own environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have about 25 minutes or so for questions and discussion now. If you could please introduce yourself before asking your question, that would be great. If I may start with one.
Yes.
There has been a lot of discussion from what I've seen regarding how the existing community structures and family structures in African societies have been breaking down.
Yeah.
And how this has resulted in youth seeking basically surrogate families in the streets and in gangs. Is that a theme that has come up in your research? I wonder if you could just expand a little bit.
Yeah, it's also well addressed in this Solutions for Youth Employment report, which came out last year, which was also supported by the ILO. It's called S4Y, and they've also looked at this particular aspect, which I must say sometimes it's exaggerated because, for example, in many places in Mali, which is considered by many as all-out conflict, it's not. It's not. These communities have been through a lot and they're quite resilient. But, like you say, there has been a consistent development of urbanization, also in Mali. It seems that rural areas are not conducive, let's say local cultures do not allow youth anymore to make that passage through to adulthood. It's very hard. So they're looking for greener pastures in urban areas, and there, of course, they're vulnerable to the short-term gain that is around. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Caitlin Vito. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm with the Institute. The Regional Mixed Migration Secretariat, based in Kenya, actually, released a report last year on what they called a culture of migration existing in a lot of these communities that these future migrants come from.
Yeah.
I was wondering, based on your experience, if you could just speak to the amount of pressure or influence that families and communities have, especially on male youth, on their decision to make that quite dangerous trek. That's it.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So this is the part where I thought, let me not dwell on it, but it's extremely important that we're not only speaking about how youth are lured into the trip towards Europe or elsewhere because of smugglers recruiting them. There's lots of pressure from the community. Normally, normally I'm saying, but in other cases they would keep this secret that they are planning to go. But in general, the most talented youth that are also, even if they don't have the means, they're most talented and they're able to work. They're strong boys. Those are being singled out for the trip. And then this would really be a community effort, like probably they've done in the past when he had to go to school and they were collecting money for his books. Now they want him and sometimes her to, let's say there should be a dividend to this. So the dividend is he's going to have to make it and then send money back. That's the deal. So we help promote his education, we help him get some opportunities, we help him get strong, and then he's the one singled out to go. And smugglers are, it's a big word, but sometimes they're really deeply ingrained in the communities. When sometimes I hear the EU, especially the High Representative last year claimed in the UN Security Council that we could, what was it, the smugglers network to attack their business case. Excuse me. Their business case is right in the communities at those levels. So if you want to do that, you have to really take a very in-depth approach. I don't know how you could ever do that. So that's why I'm saying, this can never be the only approach to attack the business model of a smuggler. Because there's a demand. Okay, that demand is not only the boys and the girls. They want to go, but there's the pressure also from the communities.
Virginia?
Hi, I'm Regina Comolli, Senior Fellow here at ISS. Thank you so much. It was fascinating. There's so many things I would like to discuss with you perhaps later on. But for now, if I can just ask you if you could expand on one of your recommendations. So you suggested that policies for the promotion of inclusion and participation should be designed and implemented. Do you have any examples, like concrete examples of such initiatives and policies being tried and with successful results?
Actually, let me think which initiatives I find. What I find very, very interesting when there's a recognition that what is working in the formal economy should be embraced. Yeah. So in Kenya, for example, which I'm taking lots of examples from there. Because I was there for 5 years, but I remember that initiative, the Juakali initiative, which has actually managed to a great extent to help and promote the kind of skills that youth need in order to get a step further. Yeah, so the Juakali, actually informal economy is very organized in Nairobi. So in the slums, there's one group that does this, other group that does that. Here is actually the frontier. You cannot pass because those are, that's where my clients are, that's where his or her clients are. So there's such an order into the disorder that we perceive. So those kind of initiatives do work. And of course, to a certain extent, also skills build up. But what I've mainly been working on and what I will do now in North Ghana is to see how young entrepreneurs can get an opportunity in certain supply chains. For example, in food supply chains, and that they get the opportunity, and also procurement rules have to be adjusted for that, by the way, because they're very, let's say, exclusive often for certain entrepreneurs. But if they're opened up for young entrepreneurs, then they have the opportunity to develop themselves to meet the quality standards, etc., etc. So this is what my main work is going into, and this is also what makes me quite optimistic, because what I've been seeing is that from here we have a bit of a gloomy picture, but I'm always excited when I walk around in some areas where there's such innovation and entrepreneurship of youth that, they don't need the state. They don't want the state. They don't want anybody to take care for them. They will cope. Yeah. So this is also important to organize education along those lines. Of course, education is more organized along, keep them down, make sure they listen. So that has to bounce back towards, building up their livelihoods themselves.
Hi, Brandi Bolson from British Army. I spent last year in Nairobi in Mogadishu, so that's what my area of interest is.
Okay.
You mentioned the 2007 elections.
Yes.
With an eye to the next elections. Have you seen the Kenyan government implementing any preventative youth engagement strategies, given that they were the key factor in 2007?
Yeah.
Because I haven't.
Yeah.
And I was just interested to know what you think they should be doing.
So let me first say that I'm no longer posted there, so I'm no longer an expert on the latest development. And by the way, when I was there, it was also difficult to get through what was really happening. I only found out after 2.5 years how things really work there. Anyway, there has been a boom, of course, in Kenya, and especially in Nairobi, in terms of economic activity, and there are quite some developments also in manufacturing, which are quite different from what we see in other African economies, where it's mainly based on natural resources driven economies. So in Kenya there's something interesting happening, which some youth are able to benefit from. I don't know whether that's thanks to or despite of government policies. There have been some conducive government policies, like, for example, the fiber optic cable, etc., and the infrastructure for internet entrepreneurs, etc. But in general, to be quite blunt, the Kenyan politicians are counting on their pyramid, which is of course organized through tribal structures, and then alliances which then would also be expected to control the rest. Yeah, and that's how they were able to mobilize so many violent groups, because their political leaders told them to do so. well, and then playing out tribal differences, which, you know, it was exacerbating the situation. But I think the Kenyan government is very creative in also, I was responsible for anti-corruption. It was one of the most frustrating experiences ever. Do you know the Integrity House? That glass building you can't look through? And I've been spending there days and days and days. No result whatsoever. So, in that sense, they're so shrewd, and they will continue. The scandals will continue, and in that sense, they keep on alienating youth, and there's lots of grievances there. So I don't think on that front they're doing very well, and it's very unpredictable. Kenya is extremely unpredictable.
Yep. So, Tom Hockley, I work as a consultant mainly with the EU on with a foreign policy instrument, working with governments coming out of a crisis, normally conflict-related crisis, so helping the governments in Nigeria have recovery plans after after the Boko Haram crisis and that type of thing. So, everything you described in terms of the causes absolutely resonates. The recapture, the lack of equitable government tension in these areas, all those things absolutely resonate. And many of those things are not new, right? They go back, sadly, for a long history, and the interventions of the aid industry haven't managed to change them. But I just wonder, because there obviously there's been a huge spike in movement in people. Mm-hmm. In some areas, things have changed, but in other areas not. So I just wondered if there are other factors, particularly things like communications, that have changed things. Is there a very different setting now in terms of, even in the remote parts of Nigeria, the understanding of what is happening in communications? Are there suddenly some new factors that trigger this?
Yeah. Well, that's I think a very relevant aspect of the speed with which we've seen, let's say, the bad guys move, because they're very creative in utilizing new communication means to expand their networks, put it like that. Also, I think in terms of communication, but you've all followed that migrants, let's say potential migrants, know what's out here. So when they're looking for an alternative and see, for example, in Europe, the important position that young people have, for example, in our media, etc., it is a big difference with Africa, a big difference. So they see that as paradise, and all kinds of communication strategies to counter that narrative, to say, well, if you would come to Europe, you don't have opportunities and it's horrible there, etc., etc. They have their own channels to find out how things really are. So, in that sense, I don't think that's necessarily bad. They know what's out here and they want to go for it. So that makes youth, I think, more assertive. And it's also been promoting that urbanization, which, I'm dealing a lot with public-private partnerships that want to promote youth in agriculture. Yeah, they want young people to stay in rural areas, but young people feel bogged down by local cultures, and they don't really have opportunities. So they know what's out there and they would go for it. So it has accelerated a lot of developments which were already there. Does that answer a bit your question? So I think there's been great work by the OECD also on how these new means can drive these new groups, and also exacerbate the fragility. So in that sense, they're able to penetrate more areas.
Okay. My name is Nick Crawford. I work for an international development consultancy called Cooning International, and I also contribute towards IISS's Island Data. As you say, locally led, politically smart approaches are really important. You also said about the need to identify areas where there is a demand for youth and not just oversupply. And so in terms of politically smart approaches, one of the things you would try to do is identify issues that the elites care about, to which the youth could be an answer.
Yeah.
So have you seen any such issues over the course of your work where youth might be an answer?
Mm-hmm. So, of course, many of the economies are stuck and don't feed the elites in the sense that they would really want to. Yeah. So, when I'm working in particular new upcoming sectors, then we see lots of youth. Starting to play a role and getting that kind of space that they would not normally get, as I've just described, in the kind of older sectors. Like in Ivory Coast, we're going to look at cacao, which is it's very difficult for youth to penetrate that sector because you need land, you need you need a buffer in order to wait for the harvest to come, etc., etc. It's dominated by old people. I think the average age is but these kind of new sectors that we see in cities, and especially coming from the informal economy, I'm stressing it again, but it's something we really have to start understanding and embracing. That's where we see a lot of innovation happening, which are also utilizing the new communication means if they have access to it. The ones on the bottom, by the way, of mobile telephone companies, etc., etc. Of course, that's still populated by elites in the board, so they can either open an area up or close it off. Which is what happened, by the way, with the elections in 2007. All of a sudden, the whole mobile network was switched off. So, yeah. Of course, there's a lot of conditions there, but I'm in that sense quite an optimist because I see them, finding new ways, and it's uncomparable to our young people because they never had to really, reinvent themselves. But there you have to reinvent yourself every day. So that makes me an optimist. Yes.
So just so my understanding of this is the issue, there's a youth bulge in Africa, and a lot of them are moving to, let's say, Western countries where there are aging populations, and there's not so many, the youth population's low. So the fact that these youth bulge is actually moving into these areas, which actually is not necessarily a negative thing. Yeah, it's reducing tensions here in Africa, and that would be in the interest of political and economic elites because they don't want youth bulges because they are a potential threat to their positions of power. Moving into these other areas where jobs are needed, there's still a lot of growth that's happening, so jobs are required. So maybe I'm just thinking, perhaps the issue isn't so much about the migration of youth, but actually how that process of youth, or the youth are being treated in that process of moving from these areas where they're being repressed through that migration period, so making sure that migration, that transition is secure and does no longer have these threats, and also when they do arrive in many of these countries where there is high demand for youth, that they are treated fairly. So perhaps another way of looking at this is actually looking at this from, it actually can be a potential positive thing. Youth bulge. There is these tensions as a result of youth bulge. The migration is not necessarily always a bad thing. So that's
I know. This is actually probably this was the elephant in the room. So I of course I can answer, but I would also be keen to have a group discussion on this. I don't know how the climate in the UK is in that sense. May I ask?
And I guess the other factor, if you look at Nigeria, in the last few years, we've had 2 million people displaced in the north because of propaganda and things. So this discussion is about youth, but also the challenge, say, in Nigeria, these 2 million people, is how do you get them to go back home, which is all the challenges of essentially governance.
Yeah.
So you're right, there may be absolutely another way of looking at it in terms of youth, but then if you look at the scale of displacement of things, across Africa, to me, it comes down to these governance things again. That's the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was sorry.
No, go on.
I mean, I was trying to work out a question on some of those. And that is, there seems to be one of the themes of our time seems to be this tension between the national state and the forces of globalization that's pulling it apart. I'm just wondering, I was going to ask you how you saw that, how your subject in the context of that, whether you see the national state, for example, as helpful necessarily part of the problem.
Wow, that's
I mean, it's a kind of a silly question.
Do you know the work of Parag Khanna, How to Run the World? Mm-hmm. Abolishing all borders? That would be the best solution for Africa, to have a kind of chaotic period, and then when the dust settled down,
Like borders in Africa.
Well, that's actually what he argued in part of his book. But then, that was, from the United States. We also have a situation of many borders, in Europe. So in that sense, I think we're also as former colonists, we are quite aware of the history of those borders and how entrenched those, let's say, also how power structures build around these territorial integrity kind of situations. And I don't know how to answer really, because but to tell you quite frankly, and of course from a meta perspective, I'm standing here as a former diplomat. I've worked 12 years for the Dutch government in several places. And what I've noticed is that it's quite limiting to be working as state-to-state structures and to expect those structures to be legitimate as soon as elections have been organized. No. This is not only not true, I think it's also irresponsible from our side to continue working through that level without looking at many of the unintended consequences it has, let's say, further in, for citizens. So that social contract between state and citizens, if ever that was there, is at least for the young generation, in many cases has been broken. It doesn't work anymore. We're still continuing to take that as a kind of blueprint. As soon as we've had elections, tick off that box and we can work with them. For me, as a diplomat, that was frustrating. So I'm a kind of how do you call that? Defiant of that kind of, yeah.
Do we have time?
Any for a very final brief
There's a little bit related to the political atmosphere we're talking about. Also, my name is Monica Monica, and I'm from the Finnish embassy. So we know that here in the UK, it's high on the political agenda to limit that immigration. And there's this demand to help people in their home countries, as source countries.
Yeah.
And your research looks into the root causes of immigration. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the projects the UK or EU level projects, where they've succeeded, what have been the challenges, and maybe you can let me a little bit on the plans moving forward.
Okay. Well, we are always looking for successes. That's for sure. There's one thing I have to note here, that in terms of focus on young people, that is very recent. You know, first, in development, gender was the fashionable topic, and now since a couple of years, it's young people, even I think too. So you see, the experiences that I'm building on are from, sometimes the work of foundations like the MasterCard Foundation and other quite youth-focused organizations. Otherwise, it's not been mainstream yet. Okay, so, but we're looking for successes, and the kind of things that we have to focus on is how to make our policies more balanced. Yeah. So from the European Union, I've been researching what has been happening through the several processes. It's the Khartoum process, the Rabat process, you name it. And there has always been a, let's say, monetary focus, put it like that, on migration management, to try and make border controls work, to try and seal it off. You remember that initiative of, I think, Senegal working together with Spain to seal off those routes. Most of the money has been invested in migration management, border controls, and some of that EU money, I know you were asking for successes, but some of that EU money
Challenges and successes.
Okay.
Yeah.
is unaccounted for. Now, unaccounted for, they don't know really what it's been spent on. That's the Court of Auditors looked at that, the EU Court of Auditors, and they're not really sure. There's questions about that. That came out in, I think, April, May. So, yeah, I mean, I can only look at what I've seen in Wajir and what I've, these kind of statements, to see that there's a lot of, let's put it like that, lessons to be learned. So, what I would say is utilize those lessons. We want to have value for money. We want to have functional border controls there as well. I'm not dreaming, huh? I'm not dreaming saying, oh, we have to address the root cause and invest in youth, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that's not going to help and mitigate this situation in the short run. But it should be more responsible and more accountable, and it can be done. But it takes more effort and more honesty about whether what really works. And otherwise, what I'm, you see, I'm an advocate. There needs to be an EU, a European Youth Action Plan for Africa, and I'm working on that to develop that. And it doesn't only mean a bag of money, absolutely not. That can make things worse. But really to see how to make whatever we do does not undermine youth, but it's rather conducive for youth.
Thank you. I think we'll have to wrap up here. Please join me in thanking Mariah for a very fascinating and timely presentation.